The Old Man's Scarecrows.
The old man's farm nearby had scarecrows, usually 6 feet tall, held by a large wooden frame plunged into the ground. They wore shabby, long-sleeved shirts and tan sun hats that were big enough to cover their stuffed burlap heads. Or at least, that's what they looked like. Multiples of them guarded his area. The old man would typically come out when the sun was rising, and again much later when it was pitch black outside. Out of the countryside was a little town, warm and friendly, and the people visited here every once in a while, often in the summer. Because of that, we always had leftover crops from our farm and would kindly hand it out to them, resulting in 10 pumpkins, 20 potatoes, a basket full of berries, and much more. I lived with my grandpa during the summer break when my parents would go on vacations by themselves. I didn't really mind, and Grandpa and I had a great bond. Along with the townspeople visiting us, there were also kids playing around the field. Sometimes we'd gather up, go out into the forest, and build a little campfire where we told folk stories. Despite me being the quiet one and not very social, it was generally a very fun time. One thing Grandpa would tell me, repeating over and over again until I could recite it in my sleep, was to never go to the old man's house. Every summer, at least one policeman would visit our farm and ask if any suspicious activity was noted. We had no clue, but apparently one kid would go missing every year on a visit. A pattern, of course, was observed. It seemed the ones who were a bit too curious and went to the old man's place would go missing, gone, never to be seen again. Typically, Grandpa would wake me up at around 5 a.m., but today was different, as he was going to the town to sell some of our crops. I was ordered to stay in the house and attend farmer activities, harvest, trim any dead leaves, water them, and plant more seeds if necessary. It was expected that he would be home around dinner time. 7 p.m. The sky grayed up, and the rain trickled down our windows. It was peaceful and calming as I read my book in the rocking chair, but eerie as well, oddly eerie for this time of year. Something then caught my eye out of the window. It was a little girl wearing what looked like a yellow dress, casually walking around the yard. She looked to be about 6 years younger than me. Probably just a visitor. The little girl stood there, moving her head toward all kinds of directions. I finally put on my rain boots and walked out of the house. Maybe she was lost. Perhaps I could help. We did have a phone which she could use. "Hi," I greeted. "I don't know if you know, but it's getting late, and you're standing out in the rain. Do you want me to walk you to the nearby town? Call someone to pick you up?" The girl, clearly naive, stared at me with big, doll-like eyes. She then shook her head no. "Well, do you want to come inside?" The girl kept staring at me, not really giving any sort of expression. I looked down to see that she was not wearing any shoes. Geez, who let her out of the house without shoes? I thought. While I kept trying to figure out what to do, the little girl playfully ran toward the farm. The old man's farm. "Hey, you're not supposed to go there." I ran as fast as I could, but the little girl was as swift as a cat running away from a predator. Through the forest she went, making it out to the clearing which led to the farm. In my mind, I was already thinking of giving up, but sure enough, I was right outside of his house. My heart beat, not out of pure exhaustion from running, but from the sheer anxiety I had suddenly that I was merely a few steps away from his front door. I gulped, blinked, and then the girl appeared again out of nowhere. She stretched out an arm toward a particular scarecrow. I was ready to bolt out of there, but I trod toward the lifeless thing. The girl's eyes followed me, making sure I kept my word, checking it out. The scarecrow had a yellow fabric loosely wrapped around its body, secured with a hemp rope. I sighed, tired of this little girl's shenanigans. I jerked my head toward her, whispering for the man not to hear me. "Look, this isn't funny. Let me take you inside to our house until my grandpa gets home, okay? This house is not safe." But the girl ignored me and walked closer to the scarecrow I was standing by. She looked up. Her eyes widened, and she audibly gasped, shocked. Curious, I looked down, and to my utter fright, the scarecrow's head had eyes bulging out of the burlap sack of its face. The white of its eyes were gruesome, bloodshot, and the irises were discolored. It fell apart when I jumped back from shock, making the head with the sun hat tumble to the ground. The fabric then unraveled from a decomposing human head, showing only bare teeth, ripped out skin, and a mostly denuded skull. I gagged and looked to my side, only to see the little girl was not there anymore. The old man's door. My hands trembled uncontrollably. It felt as if my arms and legs were numb. I was dizzy, like an earthquake was happening in slow motion. The man laughed like a maniac, and the next thing I knew I faced the ground, my vision blank and blackened. I slowly opened my eyes. I felt as though I was blind to my surroundings, and it was so dark, impossible to see even a foot ahead of me. I could not remember why I was here or where I was. I stood up, the pain throbbing in my head. I dragged my hand over the back of my head, and sure enough it was pulsating, with possibly dried blood there. A foul smell started dragging itself across my nose as I blindly walked around the room, trying to find a light switch. I only heard noises of chewing and something scurrying across the floor. My hand flicked on a piece of plastic screwed into the wall, and while it only turned on very dim overhead lights, what I saw next could have only come from a horror film. Children, once alive and not having a clue on what they were getting into, sat against the wall, each with a wooden stick impaled into them. Each of them had colored fabric wrapped around them to cover up a disturbing mess underneath. Their pink-toned skin was now bluish-gray, their eyes half-closed, staring into an empty abyss. Some fell and lay on the floor, to which the rats chewed on them gladly. The rotten stench grew stronger. A table at the corner of the room had a bunch of scratches and was permanently tinted with blood. A table at the corner of the room had a bunch of scratches and was permanently tinted with dried blood. There were yards of burlap and various colored cotton fabrics, yellow, blue, and red. But beside that was a bloodied wood axe and all sorts of disemboweling tools. A few wooden sticks settled on the floor nearby. It clicked in me, and I remembered everything that happened before this mess. Grandpa must have been so worried. I must find a way out and tell the police. I frantically looked around the room and walked upstairs to a door which did not open. Then the wood axe. Although big, my thin build would not have done it justice. I thought of lunging at it with the wooden sticks, but they were frail and thin. I stood there, finally, tears welling up. God, why did I follow that little girl? The little girl. She wore a yellow dress, also pointed me toward a scarecrow who had a yellow fabric around it, The eyes were so similar to hers as well. Could it have been? Heavy footsteps came toward the door of the basement, then sounds of moving some heavy furniture which I presumed blocked the door. The old man walked down, shaking, yet had a menacing grin across his face. He carelessly picked up one of the children, plopping them onto the table. I struggled picking up the axe with my lanky arms, but I was ready to plunge it into his crippled body. But before I threw anything at him, a few men from upstairs shouted, "Freeze!" He didn't listen, and bullets fired right into his head. The men walked rapidly down the stairs, gasping and one gagging at the terrifying sight. However, they did not notice me. No matter how loud I shouted or how many times I flailed my arms around, they instead examined the horrendous crime scene. Everything that happened in those few minutes flashed before me, but I sprinted up the stairs and dashed out of that man's house as fast as I could. It was nighttime, but I could see my grandpa's house lit up with police cars parked near our field. I got there and stood by the stairs, waiting for an answer from the police. Grandpa, like the others, did not notice me. His face was pale and sunken, and his hand quivered from holding the phone. It was concluded that the old man made scarecrows out of children whom he had kidnapped. He would dress up the scarecrows with the same color as their outfit from the day they were captured. One of the policemen walked over to us, talking to my grandpa. "Mr. Aker, what was your grandson's name?" He replied, voice weak, "Jack." "And what color was his shirt?" "Blue." The policeman stood in silence for a moment. "May I see a photo of him?" Grandpa went into his house and got a photo of me during Christmas last year and showcased it to the officer. A grim face the man had. I knew it. I knew it the second they did not notice me, and the familiar scarecrow with the blue fabric, which was chewed on by rats before it was ready to be speared into the ground, to act as guards for his crops. I followed them into that same trap, just like the other children did. The same trap the little girl fell into. I was kidnapped and turned into one of them. The Bygone Scarecrow. I moved into a new house a few days ago, and I don't mean new as the house itself, which was constructed in the late 1800s. Outside, the house is mostly covered by tall green strands of grass circled by a decrepit wooden fence. Along it stands an old scarecrow. It was mostly composed of fabric, wood, and moldy styrofoam. Half of its face was illuminated by the bright light of the moon on full nights, while the other half was submerged in shadow. Its eyes were made of old stones, squished into a moldy styrofoam ball and topped with an old straw hat. I walked away from the window and sat down on my bed. Darkness was coating the walls of the room like a blanket covering a bed. I looked to the left only to be greeted by a glowing set of numbers. 1:35 a.m. the alarm clock read. I lay down in my bed and slowly tried to drift off to sleep. After what seemed like hours, I woke up to the sound of metal against metal, faintly coming from outside of the window. I sat up and stared in the direction of the noise. I couldn't see the ground outside, so I got up and walked toward the window and looked down. I was met with the scarecrow, still standing in the cold, dark night. By the time I reached the window, the noise of course had stopped. I looked in all directions then, scanning the entire yard in the process, but to my surprise, there was nothing out of the ordinary. Well, that was until I noticed something even stranger. Something was off about the Scarecrow. It looked different. It looked much older. It appeared almost as if a century had gone by while I was sleeping. It was certainly much older now. I scanned my surroundings, and everything was the same. Nothing seemed any older than it was before I went to sleep. The Scarecrow, though, had more mold. The stone eyes were smaller and grayer, and they had a slight reddish hue, almost as if they were glowing. I took a look at my clock, only to notice that the numbers weren't numbers. The 7-segment display had strange symbols that appeared alien and foreign. I walked over and flipped on the light switch, and when I did, something weird happened. When I flipped it, the light bulb delayed a little before actually turning on. I didn't really pay attention to it, as my mind was more distracted by the Scarecrow, but I walked over to my desk, which happened to be right in front of my window, and sat down to log on to my computer, which happened to be a big old chunky Apple. I moved my mouse cursor over to the taskbar and noticed the time, the date, and the day also were all filled with strange symbols. From memory, they appeared to be Greek letters. I also noticed that the internet wasn't working. I shut down my computer and stared at the wall, trying to possibly make sense of all the current situation. That was when I heard a loud bang come from outside. I jumped out of my chair to look out of the window, only to see that the Scarecrow was gone. I started panicking. I didn't want to, but I was trying to find out where the Scarecrow could possibly have gone. Then I heard something else. The sound of old cloth and wood stretching and pulling, maybe tearing, faintly coming from the darkness of the stairs outside my bedroom door. I immediately got up and shut the door as quickly as possible, locking it in the process. Then I reached into my pocket to grab my phone and dial 911, only to realize that I had no signal. I hopped onto my bed and stared at the door, waiting for something terrible to happen. The sound of the old cloth and wood was getting closer, so close that it sounded like it was right outside my bedroom door. That's when I wake up. I looked in the direction of the clock to see that it was now perfectly working, 6:12 a.m. The sun was barely peeking over the horizon. I got out of bed to look out of the window. When I did, my heart dropped. The Scarecrow still wasn't there. Weeks have passed now, and I still have no clue where it went. And sometimes when I'm sleeping late at night, I hear the sound of stretching fabric and wood.
The Scarecrow Corpse by Stealth Fiction.
As you know, I was in training to be a coroner. My education was almost complete, and I had been working a paid internship with a well-known medical examiner in the Washington, D.C. area. All that changed a few hours ago when I was fired from the office for refusing to participate in what I believe to be a cover-up. Even though they warned me about the consequences for leaking any information about this case, my conscience wouldn't be clear if I kept quiet. This is something people need to know. A few days ago, we received a call from the Metro Police about a possible body discovered on the Red Line. Since working here, we've responded to a few calls in the subway system. The first time, it was a woman who tripped over someone's rolling suitcase while trying to pass by on the escalators. She ended up with a broken neck. Twice we went out there for a heart attack, once for a late-night mugging that went bad. The poor guy was stabbed repeatedly in the stomach, even though he handed over his watch and wallet like the mugger requested. So far, I haven't seen anything especially gory, and it was a bit of a letdown when the dispatch officer said the man was found just sitting on the train. Is it wrong that I've been looking forward to a call about someone either jumping or being pushed in front of a train? The interesting thing was the wording of the dispatch request. Possible body. If the word possible is in front of body, maybe it's the paramedics that should be responding and not the coroner's office. When we arrived, the paramedics were on the scene, so we figured it was just a miscommunication and we were called out prematurely. Police tape blocked off the whole entire section of the station platform. From our view at the top of the escalators, we could tell something wasn't right. The paramedics stood outside the door to the train car, and they weren't actually doing anything, except arguing and pointing at the body slumped up against a window inside. We could have left, but since it was a slow evening, we decided to take a look anyway, just to see what was going on. As we approached, I overheard some of the conversation between the two paramedics. "He's dead, right?" said the older of the two. "Dead people don't do that." Do what? I thought. Once they saw us, they quickly agreed that the man was dead and promptly left the scene to us. Clearly this wasn't a call they wanted to handle. I could understand that though. The police weren't much help either. I chatted with the officers on the scene while the doc went in to take a look at the man on the train. One of the detectives commented that there weren't any clear signs of foul play. The witnesses all claimed the guy just sat down like everyone else, and then he stopped breathing. Natural causes, I thought. Seemed like a pretty cut and dry case. But when I looked over my shoulder at the doc, he seemed confused. "Look at this," he said to me as I walked into the train. As I approached, it seemed like the man was just napping, like a lot of the train riders do when they know their stop won't be coming up for a while. "Look at what?" I asked. His eyes. The man's head was forward with his chin to his chest, so that I had to kneel down to get a good look at his face. As I was doing this, the doc was talking out loud like he tends to do, just going over his mental checklist. "Not breathing, no pulse, his skin is cold to the touch. Approximate time of death 6 to 8 hours ago." I was in the aisle of the train trying to make do with a pin flashlight since the dim lighting on the train wasn't helping things much. The man's eyes were open, and they seemed to be staring at me. It's not uncommon, so I leaned in closer, hoping to figure out what it was the doc wanted me to see so that I didn't look like an idiot, and then he blinked. I jumped back as quick as a mongoose would jump out of the way from a cobra. "What the f..." I tried to say. Exactly," the doc said. Got to just be a muscle spasm, right?" "You would think," he said, "but watch this." He grabbed the guy by the hair and pulled his head back. With his other hand he waved a finger in front of the man's open eyes, which then began to follow along as the doc moved his finger left and right. Then the man looked at me and blinked again. "Have you ever seen anything like this before?" "Nope." "And he's dead. As a doornail." We let the officer in charge know that we couldn't determine the cause of death on site. A full autopsy would be needed to be performed to make any kind of determination. She made a note in the report that this body had a tendency to follow you with its eyes and occasionally blink. Off the record, she told me the whole case bothered her. The man, she said, didn't have any identification, credit cards, watch, jewelry, a phone, or even money. All they found on him was a train ticket and a napkin. Once we had him back at the office, we changed into our examination overalls. I was asked to deal with his clothing. The man watched me the whole time as I stripped off his business suit. He even winked at me. Also, a few odd things were noted about his clothing. First, he wasn't wearing any undergarments. Unique, I suppose. Normally, people wear a t-shirt, boxers, or briefs and socks. This guy wore none of those things, but for some reason he had on 2 belts, one over the other. The doc switched on his tape recorder and then turned on the buzzsaw. I watched as he performed the Y incision and made a mental note of his perfect technique so that I could try and do it better next time. I'm telling you, the doc is a real artist. Next came the enjoyable cracking sound as the rib cage was pried open. All the while this was happening, the man's eyes watched us. I could almost swear he was smiling too. Over the next hour, the doc made notes as he did the exam. He handed me each organ to be weighed and catalogued. There was nothing strange or out of the ordinary about any of the internal organs. "Okay," the doc said. "Let's take a look inside his head. I want to see what's causing the eye movement. Listen, do you mind if we tape the eyes shut first?" I was trying to remain as professional as I could, but the constant blinking was unnerving me. The doc didn't mind, thank heaven, so I took some suture tape and worked up the courage to manually close his eyelids and tape them down. Immediately they began moving faster. His whole face was convulsing and contorting itself, trying to break free of the tape. "I don't think he likes that," the doc said, and then he removed the tape I had just placed on the man's eyes. The violent motion stopped right away, and he winked at the doc. "That isn't natural," I said. "There's a scientific reason for everything. It's our job to find it," the doc replied. "But he actually fought to get the tape off his eyes. I guess he wants to watch. Now, do you want to remove the skull, or should I?" I was too shaken to handle the equipment, so I watched as Doc worked the saw around the man's skull. The bastard is smiling. I'm sure of it. He was staring at me and blinking his left eye and then his right eye back and forth. I heard the familiar popping sound caused by the top of the skull being pulled off. "Whoa, okay," the doc says. "What is that?" I asked as I walked around to see what he was seeing. The man's eyes followed me, of course. "I think I might have to call this one in." Dear God, the brain was missing. "Doc?" I asked. "Not now. Pack up and go home. I'll finish cleaning this up." He was saying this as he was already dialing a number on the phone. "But, just go. I'll call you later." It wasn't a request. I know when to shut up and listen. I made my way to the door, knowing that the man was still staring at me. "And don't say anything to anyone." The doc never called me back. Each time I tried to reach him, it went to voicemail. I tried to go back the next day, but security wouldn't let me into the building. They said I was to await further instructions while on paid leave. That was 4 days ago. This morning I heard a knock on my door. It was a man who said he was with the medical examiner's office, but he looked as if he was with the CIA, FBI, or NSA. He asked if he could come in to talk. I opened the door to let him in, and as I did so, I noticed 2 other similarly dressed men sitting in a black Suburban across the street. He handed me a folder. It was a case file for the John Doe that was found on the train. Of course, all of the notes about the eye movement and the blinking were redacted. There was no mention of anything out of the ordinary, let alone a missing brain. It already had the doc's signature on it, and this man was asking me to sign it as well. I tried to tell him the files were wrong, but he held up his hand to stop me from speaking. "This is how it happened. Sign it," he said. I asked about the doc. I wanted to know why I hadn't heard from him. He said the doc had been let go. The way he said it made me think the worst. After that, I refused to sign it and asked to speak to the director of the medical examiner's board. The man informed me that it would be impossible and that I was to be fired. But fired isn't the word he used. The word he used was terminated. He left when I asked him to go, but he warned me that mentioning this to anyone would have dire consequences. As soon as the door closed behind him, I packed a bag and took off. I saw that a black Suburban was parked at the end of my street, and I might just be paranoid, but I think it pulled out after I did. Just in case I was being followed, I changed directions several times. When I felt safe enough, I pulled into a nearby residential neighborhood and found an open Wi-Fi signal. I think something strange is going on in DC, maybe elsewhere as well. I don't know what it could be, but I feel like the doc and I stumbled onto something we weren't supposed to know about, and now we're in danger. I found the doc's home number online. When I called it, it went straight to voicemail. I tried to leave a message for him, but the line went dead once I began talking. If someone is monitoring my phone calls, it's possible my car is bugged too, and they already know exactly where I am. Again, maybe I'm just paranoid, or crazy. Maybe there is a completely logical explanation for the Scarecrow corpse that stares, and blinks, and winks, and smiles. I can't imagine how anything like that could exist, or why. I'm scared, really, really scared. I decided the only thing to do would be to write this down and email it out to everyone I know. Hopefully this information will make it to someone. If you received this and haven't heard back from me by tomorrow, then I'm probably dead, and you'll know what I've written is true.